Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Yeah, this one's pretty interesting. Um, we're going to be talking about the California workers' comp system
Oh,
and specifically focusing on all the reports and timelines involved.
right.
Because as we were kind of looking at this stuff for this deep dive, we realized,
It's a lot.
yeah, it can be pretty complicated. So we wanted to kind of break it down into more manageable pieces.
Absolutely.
And just so everyone knows, we're working from Chapter 7 from a document that's specifically focused on the California workers' comp system.
Okay.
We'll link it in the show notes, of course, but
Yeah.
it's a pretty hefty document. So think of this as like a roadmap,
Hmm.
to help you kind of navigate this complex system and make sure injured workers in California are getting the benefits they're entitled to.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. It's really about protecting workers,
Right.
helping them get back on their feet after they experience a work-related injury.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that really jumped out at us when we were looking at this stuff was just how important these deadlines are when it comes to filing these reports.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about paperwork, right? It's about ensuring that the entire process moves smoothly for the injured worker.
Exactly. For many people who get hurt at work, these benefits are essential, right? They're a lifeline
Right.
while they recover. So any delay in the paperwork can mean a delay in getting those benefits, which, as you can imagine, can cause real hardship.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about that very first report, the doctor's first report, or the DFR.
Right.
I feel like that's kind of the jumping off point for this whole process, right?
It really is. The DFR is filed by the primary treating physician.
Okay.
Or in some cases, it might be the emergency room doctor or the urgent care physician if they're the first ones to see the injured worker.
Right.
But here's the critical part.
Okay.
It has to be filed within 5 working days of that very first visit.
5 working days.
5 working days. That's not a suggestion.
Wow.
It's the law.
Okay, so that is a tight window.
It is.
I'm guessing there's some pretty significant consequences if that deadline is missed.
There are. For the worker, it means there's a chance their benefits will be delayed. And for the doctor, there could even be penalties.
Wow.
So that 5-day window is really important.
It sounds like this DFR is a lot more than just a quick check-in. What kind of information needs to be included in that initial report?
It's a comprehensive look at the injury and the worker's overall health. You've got things like the employee's details, their medical history,
Okay.
any pre-existing conditions they might have, what the doctor finds during the examination, their diagnosis, and very importantly, a detailed treatment plan.
Okay, so it really sets the stage for everything that comes after.
It does.
The treatment plan, I imagine, is especially important, right?
Oh, absolutely. A well-documented treatment plan benefits everyone. It sets clear expectations for the worker, for the physician, and for the claims administrator.
Yeah.
And that clarity, it just helps things run smoothly and efficiently.
So the DFR gets things rolling. But then, as the worker's treatment progresses, how does the system stay updated on their condition?
That's where progress reports come in.
Okay.
They're also known as PR2s,
Okay.
and they're regular check-ins on the worker's condition and how they're responding to treatment.
How often do these need to be filed?
So the general rule is at least every 45 days.
Okay.
But if the doctor examines the worker,
Mm-hmm.
a report is due within 20 days of that exam.
Gotcha. So pretty frequent updates just to keep everyone in the loop.
Exactly.
What kind of information is included in these progress reports?
Think of it as an update to that initial snapshot from the DFR.
Okay.
It covers things like the worker's current status, both from their perspective and the physician's observations.
Okay.
It also details how they're responding to treatment, any updates to their diagnosis or treatment plan, and a clear explanation for any new treatment requests.
It sounds like communication between the physician and the claims administrator is really key here.
It's absolutely essential. If there's any confusion or lack of clarity, it can lead to delays.
Right.
And as we've already discussed, delays can really impact the injured worker.
Absolutely. So we got these regular progress reports, but are there any other times when a physician would need to file a report outside of that regular schedule?
Yes, definitely. There are what we call trigger points, specific events that signal the need for a report right away.
Okay.
For example, if the employee's condition changes unexpectedly, that would require a report. Or if there are any changes to the treatment plan,
Gotcha.
another report. Or if the employee returns to work, even if it's with modifications.
Okay, so any significant changes to the worker's situation?
Exactly. Other triggers would include the worker leaving work,
Mm-hmm.
changes to their work restrictions, being discharged from care, or if the physician determines that the worker's permanent disability prevents them from going back to their usual job.
That's a lot to keep track of.
It is, but it really ensures that the system has all the information it needs to properly support the worker.
Right.
These reports help assess the worker's needs and make sure they're getting the appropriate benefits and care.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what happens when a worker needs a specific treatment or test or service? How does that get approved?
That's where the request for authorization, or RFA, comes in.
Okay, the RFA. So another important form in this whole process.
It is. When a doctor wants to get a specific treatment approved,
Yeah.
they submit an RFA along with any supporting documentation to the claims administrator.
So the claims administrator has the final say.
Well, they review the request, and they do it in light of the Medical Treatment Utilization Schedule, which we call the MTUS for short.
Right.
And that basically outlines appropriate treatments for various injuries. So based on that, the claims administrator makes their decision
Right.
and then communicates it back to the physician.
Okay, so it's a collaborative approach.
Yes.
So the physician makes the recommendation based on what they think the worker needs, but then the claims administrator approves or denies it based on these established guidelines.
Exactly.
Okay. So that brings us to the final stage in our journey today. The Permanent and Stationary Report, sometimes called the PR3 or PR4.
Right.
What's the significance of this report?
Well, this report is filed when the employee's condition has stabilized,
Okay.
meaning that it's unlikely to improve any further. Hence the name permanent and stationary.
Okay, I see. So kind of a turning point in the worker's recovery process.
It does. The P&S report documents the extent of any permanent impairment,
Okay.
any limitations the worker might have as a result of their injury, and outlines any future medical needs they may have.
And this report is a big deal when it comes to determining their disability benefits, right?
Huge.
Yeah.
The information in the P&S report is absolutely crucial
Okay.
for assessing the level of disability accurately and making sure the worker gets the benefits they're entitled to.
And I'm guessing, just like with all the other reports, there's a specific deadline for this one as well.
You bet. The doctor has 20 days from the date of the exam to file the P&S report.
20 days. Okay.
Yeah.
And what kind of information needs to be included in this final comprehensive report?
It's a pretty thorough medical history. We're talking about the date of the exam, injury history, the patient's complaints,
Okay.
all the information reviewed in preparing the report, medical history,
Wow.
examination findings, and the diagnosis.
So quite a bit of information there.
Yes, but it also includes the recommended treatment plan,
Okay.
any apportionment of disability, so like how much of the disability is due to the work injury versus any other contributing factors,
Right.
and the percentage of disability caused by the work incident itself.
Okay. So it really brings everything together, the whole story from the initial injury to where the worker's at now.
Exactly. There are also specific considerations for psych injuries that the report needs to address as well.
Of course, those can be particularly complex cases. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to make sure I understand the difference between the P&S report and what's called a medical legal report,
Okay.
because they sound kind of similar.
They do, but there's a key difference.
Okay.
The P&S report is filed as part of the normal course of treatment,
Okay.
and it's reimbursed according to what's called the official medical fee schedule. Medical legal reports, on the other hand, are usually generated when there's a dispute in the case, and they're reimbursed according to a different fee schedule called the medical legal fee schedule.
Gotcha. So the P&S report is kind of standard operating procedure, while the medical legal report is more for when there's a disagreement or an issue that needs to be resolved.
Exactly.
Okay. And one last thing.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned that for injuries that happen on or after January 1st, 2005, the P&S report needs to use the American Medical Association's guides to the evaluation of permanent impairment.
Right. The 5th edition.
Yeah, the 5th edition.
Yeah.
Can you just quickly explain what those are and why they're important?
Sure. The AMA guides, as they're often called, are essentially a tool
Okay.
that doctors use to figure out how severe a worker's permanent impairment is.
Okay.
It's a way to make sure that these evaluations are done fairly and consistently, across the board.
Right. So it's a way to standardize things a little bit.
Exactly. It also helps protect both the worker and the employer
Okay.
by providing a clear framework for determining the level of impairment.
So it's like a level playing field.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from the initial DFR all the way to the permanent and stationary report. It's clear that each of these reports plays a really important role in the whole workers' comp system.
Absolutely. Understanding their purpose and the deadlines involved is really key
Right.
to making sure that the entire process goes smoothly for everyone.
Well, this has been incredibly helpful.
Glad to hear it.
I feel like I have a much better grasp on this whole process now.
I'm glad. And remember, the more you know about the system, the better prepared you are to deal with it.
Absolutely. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break and come back for First. Part 2 of our deep dive into California's workers' compensation reports and timelines. We'll be exploring some additional requirements and some key differences within this fascinating, albeit complex, system. Stay tuned.
Sounds good.
And we're back with Part 2 of our deep dive into California's workers' compensation system.
Picking up right where we left off, still digging into all those crucial reports.
Right, exactly. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle, right?
Right.
Each one gives us a little bit more information, a clearer picture of how this whole thing works for the worker.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, before we go any further, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned in Part 1, the physician's return to work and voucher report.
Okay.
It sounds like this report comes in a little later in the process, right? After someone's, kind of on their way back to work.
It does. It's required when a worker reaches permanent and stationary status, but they still have what we call a permanent partial disability. It's really about providing support as they transition back into the workplace,
Gotcha.
even if they can't perform all their old duties.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like a bridge almost
Yeah,
between, recovery and actually getting back on the job.
exactly.
Now, another thing I remember you talking about, the American Medical Association's guides to the evaluation of permanent impairment, the 5th edition.
Yeah.
It seems like those play a big part in this whole process. Can you remind us again what those are and why they're so important?
Sure. The AMA guides, as we usually call them, are a really important tool for physicians when they're trying to determine how severe a worker's impairment is.
Okay.
For injuries that happened after January 1st, 2005, the PNS report has to actually reference these guidelines.
Okay.
It's kind of a way to make sure that these evaluations are done fairly and consistently, across the board.
So it's like a standard,
Exactly.
a benchmark that everyone uses.
It also helps protect both the worker and the employer by giving them a clear framework for determining the level of impairment.
So it's a win-win for both sides.
It is.
Now, one thing that's really stood out to me as we've been going through this is this emphasis on clear communication between the physician and the claims administrator.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that's a recurring theme here.
It really is. This whole system relies on accurate and timely information.
Right.
So if there's any breakdown in communication,
Yeah.
it can cause delays, frustration for everybody involved.
And as we've said, delays can have a real impact on the injured worker.
Right. And that's why it's really crucial for the physician to not only file those reports on time, but to make sure they're providing really clear and detailed explanations for their treatment recommendations.
So it's not just about checking boxes.
No.
It's about giving the full picture.
Exactly.
Because the claims administrator isn't a mind reader.
Right.
They need to understand why you're recommending what you're recommending
Precisely.
so they can make the right decisions.
It's about giving them the full picture, the why, behind each step of the recovery process.
So really, this is a partnership
It is.
between the physician and the claims administrator to make sure things run smoothly.
Absolutely.
And of course, at the heart of all this is the injured worker, right?
Of course.
I've talked a lot about reports and procedures, but we can't forget that this system is here to protect them, to help them get back on their feet.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of the worker, you asked a really interesting question at the end of Part 1 about how all this knowledge about the workers' comp system can benefit both workers and their employers.
Right.
I think that's something worth exploring a little bit more.
Definitely. When workers understand their rights, and how the system works,
Yeah.
they can take a more active role in their recovery.
Mm-hmm.
They can ask the right questions, make sure their doctor's doing what they need to do,
Right.
and advocate for the treatment they need.
Yeah. So it's empowering.
Exactly.
And on the employer side, this knowledge can be valuable too, right?
For sure.
It allows them to make sure their employees are being treated fairly.
Hmm.
Claims are being handled efficiently.
Right. It's in everyone's best interest to avoid delays and disputes.
Absolutely. It's about transparency, understanding on both sides
Exactly.
to make this whole process a little smoother, a little more positive for everybody.
And speaking of understanding,
Okay.
I think there's one more important point we should cover before we move on.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Let's talk about those medical legal reports again.
Okay.
Remember we mentioned that those come into play when there's a disagreement about a claim?
Right. So it's like a tiebreaker
Yeah, a good way to think about it.
when the worker and the claims administrator aren't seeing eye to eye.
Exactly.
Okay.
But here's the interesting part. The way those medical legal reports are reimbursed, it's handled through a separate fee schedule.
Okay.
It's called the medical legal fee schedule, and it can be different from the official medical fee schedule used for things like the PNS report.
So there are different financial considerations with these reports.
There can be. And because these reports are so important for resolving disputes,
Yeah.
they often involve a more in-depth evaluation,
Okay.
more analysis of the worker's condition.
Gotcha.
It can require more time, more expertise from the physician.
So it makes sense that there's a separate fee schedule
Right.
to reflect all that extra work.
Exactly. It highlights another layer of complexity in the workers' comp system, you know?
Right.
It's a good reminder that even when things seem pretty straightforward on the surface, there can be details and nuances that are really important to understand.
It seems like the more we dig into this, the more we realize how much there is to learn.
That's the fun part.
Yeah, that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating.
It's a journey of discovery.
It is.
And I love the process of breaking down this information
Yeah.
and making it more accessible for our listeners.
Me too. And I think we have even more to uncover, right? So on that note, we're going to take another quick pause and come back for part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll finish exploring all those important aspects of California's workers' compensation system. We'll make sure we don't miss anything. Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone. We're on the final leg of our journey exploring California's workers' compensation system, zeroing in on those all-important reports and timelines.
Yeah, we've really been through a lot, haven't we? From the DFR, progress reports, RFAs. It's been quite the adventure.
It really has, but it feels good to be getting a handle on this whole system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's still some interesting stuff left to cover.
Yeah, so what other insights did you find as you were digging into all this? What stood out?
You know, one thing that really hit me was the responsibility that falls on the doctor in this whole process. It's
Yeah.
more than just filling out the forms correctly and on time.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding how these reports can impact the worker's life, you know, on a practical level.
Right, the human element of all
Oh.
this.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for the physician to be more than just a doctor.
Oh.
They need to be an advocate too.
Right.
Not just for the worker's medical needs, but for their overall well-being as they go through this whole system.
It's about being a guide for the injured worker,
Exactly.
helping them navigate this whole thing.
Being knowledgeable about the process, being thorough with their documentation,
Right.
proactive in their communication with the claims administrator.
It's a big job.
It is.
Now, looking back at the source material, there was a section about disputes that can arise over payment for medical services.
Yeah.
What are some common mistakes that physicians make that could lead to those kinds of problems, and how can they avoid them?
Well, a lot of payment disputes come down to communication, really clear communication, and thorough documentation. When a physician submits an RFA,
Okay.
they need to make sure that every single treatment request has a clear explanation behind it.
Okay.
Why it's necessary.
Right.
How it fits into the overall plan for the worker's recovery.
So you can't just say, this person needs physical therapy and leave it at that.
Right, you have to explain why that type of therapy is important,
Right.
how often it's needed, what the goals are.
Really spell it out for the claims administrator.
Exactly. It's like you're connecting the dots for them, showing them the whole picture,
Gotcha.
the logic behind each step.
Okay.
And of course, it's also really important for physicians to stay up to date
Right.
on the latest guidelines and regulations, you know, like the MTUS,
The MTUS, yeah.
which outlines the appropriate treatments for all sorts of injuries.
So continuing education is important,
Absolutely.
not just to stay sharp medically,
Yeah.
but to know the ins and outs of the system as well.
It's a constantly evolving field.
Now, we've talked a lot about the physician and the claims administrator,
Mm-hmm.
but what about the worker themselves? What can they do to help ensure things go smoothly?
That's a great question, and it's really important for workers to remember that they're not just along for the ride.
Yeah.
They can be active participants in their recovery.
Right.
And a big part of that is staying informed,
Okay.
asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be afraid to ask your doctor to explain anything you don't understand about your treatment or the workers' comp process itself.
Be your own advocate.
Exactly. And communication is a two-way street.
Right.
Make sure you're keeping your doctor updated on any changes in your condition, any new symptoms you might be having, or any problems with your treatment.
Okay, so it's all about communication.
It really is. The
Yeah.
more your physician knows, the better they can advocate for you.
So no matter who you are, injured worker, employer or physician.
Right.
Knowledge is power in this whole workers' comp world.
It really is.
Understanding the system, being an active participant, that makes all the difference.
And we have to remember, this system is here to protect workers, to support their recovery.
It's a safety net designed to make sure that people who get hurt on the job are taken care of.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive.
It is.
I feel like we've shed some much-needed light on a topic that can feel very confusing and overwhelming.
I agree.
And I hope our listeners feel a little more confident navigating the system.
Me too.
And advocating for themselves or for their employees. We encourage you to keep learning about this important topic.
Yes.
Just reach out to resources if you need more specific guidance.
Absolutely.
Because remember, knowledge is the first step toward a smoother, more successful experience with the workers' compensation system. Until next time, keep diving deep.